Sheet Ghost by Slimebeast. Have you ever seen a sheet ghost? You know, the generic covering spook dressed in a white sheet with eye holes. You've only seen them on television and in movies, right? Charlie Brown dressed as one, Mystery Inc. unmasked one on an episode of Scooby-Doo. However, actual ghost stories rarely adopt this image. Real ghosts, if you believe in them, usually take the form of boring orbs of light or plain old humans. People laugh at the idea of a cartoon ghost fluttering about, but at least it's a touch more creative than some random semi-transparent person. So, what would you say if I told you I've seen a sheet ghost? Maybe you chuckled a bit when I said that. Maybe you shook your head disapprovingly and you're about to stop listening. I'd advise against it. When I'm done, you might find yourself just a little more wary of sheet-clad specters than you were before. When I was 15, I fractured both of my forearms. Up until that point in my life, I displayed that sense of immortality older folks always accuse teens of having. I behaved like I was invincible, which led to a skateboard jump that probably looked amazing for about 3 seconds. Then, I threw my arms out in front of me to stop the oncoming pavement. The gruesome twin pops told me everything I needed to know before the runaway train of agony traveled to my brain. After my friends were through freaking out, a call to 911 had me in the back of an ambulance and on my way to the Holcomb County Hospital. You know how it went from there. I was partially scolded by EMS workers for not wearing elbow or knee pads. Nurses in the emergency room told me I was fortunate not to have broken anything else, and so on. I tuned them out at the time, partially because I was an angsty teenager, and partially because I was in the worst pain I had felt in my life. So far, at least. Luckily, only one wrist needed surgery. The other would heal itself over time. I found myself in double casts when I woke up after the procedure. I studied my arms and chuckled, declaring that I was the world's largest lobster, a concept likely brought about by the medication. The stickers and writing on my casts told me that some of my dumbass friends had come by while I was still knocked out, and had probably left out of boredom shortly thereafter. As my vision and my mind cleared, I read the scribblings out loud. Glad you didn't die. Get well, you smell, go to hell. I wasn't watching, do it again. Classic. The audible wheezing started while I was peeling off an Arcade Fire sticker. I didn't pay any attention to whoever was in the bed next to mine until that wheeze built into a rasping cough. After a few awkward moments of staring at that curtain dividing us, I couldn't take the guttural retching for any longer without speaking up angrily. "Dude," I commented. Admittedly, I was only concerned with how much the patient was grossing me out, but again, I was 15. "Dude, are you alright, or?" I asked, trailing off so the whooping chain smoker could interrupt and tell me they were fine. Instead, there was no answer, just noise. I leaned dangerously far off the bed, especially in my woozy state. I threw the curtain aside with a rough sweep of a nearly numb arm. The bed was empty. There was no second patient. Worse yet, I could still hear the gradual tapering off of a pathetic, barely audible wheeze. The bed wasn't just empty. It was pristine, covered with a perfectly crisp white sheet, and ready for the next person who needed a place to recover. I picked up the button to ring for a nurse as best I could, and was about to mash it down with the other hand. All at once, feelings of embarrassment came over me as I realized my phantom roommate must have been another byproduct of the drugs. I put the button back down and laughed to myself as I studied the bare bed once again. Then, the sheet began to rise, feeling like an inflating lung drawing a slow, deep breath. I stared, confused at first, then stupefied, as it settled into the shape of a covered, motionless body. I fumbled for the call button again, jamming it rapidly. The draped figure sat up slowly from the bed, its rigid form staring forward and thankfully paying no attention to my presence. I stared in stunned silence as the figure slid from the bed and stood, never dropping the sheet that draped back over its head. The body behind the sheet, as far as I could see, did not exist. I know what you're expecting at this point, and no, I didn't follow it. I sat there like a good boy and waited for the nurse to come in and tell me I was suffering from a pretty hardcore hallucination. I sat for minutes on end, watching as the cloaked figure stood facing the room's door, groaning loudly to itself. The sound was a droning, almost forlorn "oh." It repeated the ominous noise again and again until I was completely convinced I would lose my mind. If the stomach-gnawing dread didn't do me in, the soul-chilling din would. No one was coming. Somewhere deep inside, I knew that for a fact. I didn't understand what was happening, but I was slowly coming to the realization that yes, it was indeed happening. The silver doorknob caught my attention. One groping turn, even with my useless club arms, would allow the thing to pass through the doorway, relieving me of its horrifying presence. So, I did it. I stood up, approached cautiously, and let it out. A jolt of terror electrified my nervous system as the sheet-covered non-entity unexpectedly turned and, with one sweeping motion, grabbed at my arm. Its face, that blank, expressionless face indented in fabric, hung motionless before me. Even though there was no readable emotion on it, I could feel that the thing was taking full notice of me for the first time since it appeared. I backed away quickly, nearly stumbling over my feet as the empty bedsheet moved through the doorway. Relief washed over me as I nearly crumpled to the floor. My head felt light, and the beating of my racing heart rose up in my ears to replace the ghostly wail. The door creaked on its hinges, echoing in the silent hall beyond. There were no voices, no beeps and boops of medical equipment, nothing but the groan gradually fading into the distance. I called out for help, to anyone who could hear me. I was met with that same eerie silence. Cautiously poking my head out of the door, I could see the figure was a safe distance away, steadily shambling its way through a pair of push doors. I squinted at the signage near the end of that hall, and one word immediately stood out to me. Mortuary. The morgue. Yup, that was enough for me. I closed the door as quietly as possible, crept back to my bed, and tucked myself right in. I noped out of the situation in as calm and orderly a fashion as possible. I don't know if you've ever heard the term out of sight, out of mind, but I tried to live that phrase. Alone in the room once more, I decided that I had indeed been hallucinating, and that absolutely nothing was out of the ordinary. Repeated glances to the bed next to me, now lying bare, defied my attempts to regain some shred of comfort. Its covering was gone, no matter how many times I looked away, closed my eyes, slowly counted to 10, and looked back. After a brief period of time that felt like an eternity, I decided that it had always been that way. I chuckled at the absurdity of imagining a made bed. I laid back, squeezed my eyes shut, and tried to force sleep. All that I could see, of course, was a certain white figure standing motionless in the pitch-black void behind my eyelids. I could try to fool myself, but the human mind doesn't let go of those images quite so quickly. A realization dawned on me, causing my eyes to pop open again. The nurse still hadn't come. I could deny everything else until fatigue eventually won out and I slipped into a dream, but the fact that no one had answered the call button was an inarguable fact. I pressed it again, then a third time. Nothing. For all I knew, I was alone, isolated in a strange, second state of being with only the memories of a phantom to keep me company. With the icy, bone-fingered grip of fright clasping my insides once more, I curled up in a fetal position and drew the blanket over my head. I had to shut the world out until it decided to behave properly and start making sense again. A new sound violated my ears. It was the most awful, maddening sound yet. An alarm rang out through the hospital, bringing to mind every doomsday scenario I'd seen in a disaster movie. The repeated digital squeal was warped, wrong. It slowed down and warped, dragging each death knell out in the most obnoxious, garbled screech. I had to leave. Not just the bed, not just the room, but the entire hospital. The almost pleasant post-surgery numbness was giving way to a dull ache that would only grow more insufferable over time. I didn't care, though. I'd choose the pain over staying in that madhouse any day. The roar of the alarm grew louder as I moved my head from the pillow and threw my blanket to the floor. Darkness. All that I could see of the room were faded swaths of reality bathed in the flickering red emergency lighting. I don't remember if I cried out, but I know I wouldn't have been able to hear myself over the din either way. I leaned against the wall and made my way back to the door, working the knob again and swinging it open with my foot. The hallway was just as confusing, warning lights flickering in a weak attempt to lay out a path to safety. I kept to the wall as I moved through, pressing the casts against my ears to lessen the sensory overload. My brisk walk along the suggested route to the exit was halted when I realized where I was headed. The mortuary. The double doors were right in front of me, and I hadn't noticed until I was face to face with them. It made no sense. I thought that I must have gotten turned around, that no actual route of escape would lead deeper into the building, but the conclusion was clear. Even with the distractions around me, I knew I was being guided in the wrong direction. The lit path, the pointing exit signs, and even the floor plan affixed to the wall were directly lying to me. So, naturally, the most sensible option was to turn around and do the exact opposite of what they said. I pivoted on my heels and sprinted in the other direction. I could feel my brow knotting up in confusion as I looked ahead. Through some deformity of time and space, I found myself once again headed toward the distant doors of the hospital morgue. Both ends of the hallway ended at the same location. No matter how rapidly I looked between them, both duplicates of the entrance remained firmly in place. I didn't need to get back to my room. I needed to get into any room. I had no idea what floor of the building I was on, but I knew I was going out of a window regardless. Flinging a random door open, I ducked through and into what should have been safety. Instead, I found that the door opened back into the same corridor with the same intimidating destination. The room number read 318, but the interior was a red-drenched hallway. Moving to the next door, I found 317, opened into the same exact space. So did 316, 315, and so on. I lost all hope in that moment. Either I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from, or I was going to die from the throbbing stress of sight and sound that threatened to burst my heart and mind. Neither option looked good. Boom. The double doors flew open, thrown wide as if they had been kicked out. In every direction, all around me, an inexplicable house of mirrors displayed nearly identical images. It was a dark figure, black in silhouette, as if to contrast the walking sheet I'd just gotten rid of. I say the figures were only nearly identical because, as my maddened owl's gaze was fixed in each direction, I noticed differences in speed and movement. The reflections at every end of every hallway within view were deviating from their clones as they approached me at the very center. The figure hovered above the stark white hospital floor, and as it levitated toward me, I could see what it truly was. A body bag. Shredded from the knees down, wisps of plastic hanging in tatters. Neon yellow warning tape wrapped the vertical bag as if it had pressed its way through a cautionary web and became ensnared in the process. My hands moved from my ears to my eyes, letting the full blast of the alarm pierce my skull again. Blotting out the scene in front of me seemed much more important. Suddenly, silence. I knew what that moment of quiet meant, and I feared it more than the noise. The thing, the body bag, had reached its prey. It stood directly in front of me. It stood all around me. I felt as if I could have suffocated in the middle of their reeking, stifling bodies. I dropped my arms to my sides and let my head sink. There was nothing I could do, nowhere I could run. Somewhere along the line I had passed from my own world into a parasitic twin dimension. Hell, I considered the idea that I might have suffered complications in surgery, and that I was already dead. I opened my eyes, first staring balefully at the perfectly lit tiles under my feet, then raising my view to the thing in front of me. While I wasn't looking, the world had corrected itself, though the upright body bag still remained. "What do you want from me, man?" I whispered in a barely audible voice. There was only one now. One gleaming, dark form, its zippered face locked onto mine. Something spilled from beneath it, something wet, gelatinous, and smelling of death. a single interwoven rope of entrails. The braided innards spasmed and twirled around each other, pulling themselves upward into the air like the searching tentacle of a sea monster. I gagged at the sight, my heaving stomach wanting nothing more than to uncontrollably spill its contents. The disgusting, spaghetti-like appendage wound itself around my arm. Despite my protests, I couldn't pull away. My screams fell on dead ears. I could feel the decayed flesh of the thing working its way around the cast, popping stitches, violating the fresh incision on my wrist. I don't know if there was some sort of shared thought as it tried to merge with my tissue, or if my thoughts had simply cleared in a moment of fight-or-flight panic. Either way, I now knew exactly what it wanted from me, the same thing it had tried to grab back in the hospital room. It needed my hand. It needed the fresh working part added to its conglomeration of meat, an appendage that wasn't locked in place by rigor mortis. It wanted to open doors, doors to other patients, doors to other buildings. I shrieked again, pulling my arm away as hard as humanly possible and falling to the floor in the process. The ripping of skin and tensing of sinew was unbearable. As I rolled on the floor in pain, a primal feeling took over. I couldn't die there. I couldn't die like that. I couldn't suffer whatever it wanted to do to me next. Wrapping the tentacle around my free arm, I brought it to my face and bit in. I ripped the fetid, slimy guts with my back teeth, gnawing them apart with the growl of a rabid dog. Spurts of blood and bile commingled on my face. When I had freed myself, I awkwardly crawled backward on my hands and heels. Another strand of innards emerged from beneath the attacker, then another. It swept toward me, through the air, appearing as if it was walking on 6 squid legs, then floating as a proper ghost should. I scrambled to my feet and ran as the sloppy, slick sound of organs on marble fell rapidly behind me. Dodging quickly into a room, I slammed the door shut behind me and once again collapsed onto my back. This time, it was from relief instead of terror. Just outside, I could see the black plastic head and glinting zipper through a frosted glass window in the door. A moist, slurping sound accompanied frustrated, fumbling half-turns of the doorknob. I spat a mixture of puke and bodily fluids at the floor. Then, I lifted my shaking hand, the hand it had tried to take from me, and I raised my middle finger. "This is all I'm giving you, bitch." I don't know exactly when or how I blacked out. There's a missing period of time between the enraged howl of the patchwork beast and the sound of nurses shouting at me. I awakened to a frenzied group of concerned faces as I was lifted from the place I had fallen and was placed back in my bed. I had spent the worst moments of my life with a ghost, a sheet ghost, no less. However, to the staff of the county hospital, nothing out of the ordinary happened. If you were to believe them, I rang for a nurse and she immediately came to my room, where I had lost consciousness after biting into my own wrist. Chalk it up to a bad reaction to the medication if you want, I guess. There's one problem with that story, though. When my loser friends came around to visit again, I told them all about the dream I had. They were equal parts grossed out and enthralled. Especially Rat, the weird girl with a penchant for horror stories. It wasn't long after I told my tale that she chimed in with some unwelcome information. Apparently, there used to be a notable mortician on staff at that very hospital more than a decade ago. One who had a sick fascination with cutting out pieces of dead patients and doing God knows what with them. When he was caught lifting the liver of an organ donor, he was sentenced to a lengthy prison term. Newspapers labeled him the Morgue Man, and nearly 100 bodies were exhumed in an attempt to find the scope of his crimes. After everything came to light, the only time he was out of state custody was spent on a hospital bed due to a prison stabbing. He died soon after. That was likely to be the very same bed I had shared my room with. So, yeah. Maybe you still aren't afraid of sheet ghosts. They're just low-effort Halloween costumes and lazy creature designs, right? Me? I never want to see one again. I hope you never see one at all.